Hollywood had no problem shoving garbage down your throat, but these westerns, they buried them alive. A Sam Peckinpah masterpiece tossed into double-feature obscurity, a Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson film buried under production chaos, and a western so ignored that even Siskel and Ebert had to go digging for it. These movies had the stars, the talent, and the stories to be legendary. So why did the industry erase them? Universal buried this movie. No marketing, barely any theaters, just quietly dumped and forgotten. And honestly, that's insane. This is one of the best westerns ever made. It's Willie Nelson and Gary Busey in an offbeat mythic western about an outlaw teaching a young cowboy the ways of the world. Universal should have had a hit on their hands, but instead the studio barely gave it a release. It was featured on an episode of the television show Siskel and Ebert, dedicated to uncovering worthy sleepers, and Gene Siskel said he had to drive 50 miles just to find a theater playing it. Roger Ebert was at Cannes when it premiered and wanted to review it, but Universal had already pulled it from release. Their reason? The movie wasn't making it. Well, maybe nobody saw it because you didn't put it anywhere, Universal. Even Willie Nelson himself knew how special this was. He read just 2 pages of the script and immediately said, "I want to be this guy." And Pauline Kael called it spirited and satisfying, praising Nelson's incredible screen presence. But despite great reviews, Universal treated it like an embarrassment. A budget somewhere between $5 and $10 million, nobody knows for sure, and a box office take of just $1.7 million. And not because the movie was bad, just because Universal decided it wasn't worth their time. Everyone knows The Wild Bunch, but this is the Sam Peckinpah movie that gets overlooked, and it shouldn't, because it's incredible. Joel McCrea, Randolph Scott, Warren Oates, legendary actors. Scott even retired right after making this, saying he wanted to go out on a high note because he'd never be able to top this performance. So what did MGM do with this absolute gem of a film? They dumped it into double features, and not even with other westerns. They paired it with Boys' Night Out, a random sex comedy, and The Tartars, an Italian medieval movie. Yeah, because that audience is totally here for a slow-burn, character-driven western. But here's where it gets funny. Audiences did not care about the main features. They were showing up just for Ride the High Country. MGM finally realized their mistake and gave it a better release, but only after they accidentally discovered that people loved it. James Drury later said, "The whole movie was magical. It became a classic western that has always remained in circulation. People think the world of it." It's a movie about 2 aging cowboys, friendship, betrayal, and regret. And if that final scene doesn't hit you right in the gut, nothing will. Another Peckinpah western that Hollywood couldn't be bothered to promote. This was his favorite film, starring Jason Robards, David Warner, Slim Pickens, the one he always wanted to show people. And yet, Warner Brothers treated it like an afterthought. The production was chaos, bad weather, constant delays. And when filming was suspended, Peckinpah drank. A lot. When they finally wrapped, the bar bill alone was $70,000, which, in today's money, is over $500,000. By the time the movie was finished, it was 19 days over schedule and $3 million over budget. Warner Brothers had already lost patience with Peckinpah, and this was the final straw. They cut ties with him completely, and just to rub salt in the wound, they barely released the movie. The studio didn't care that audiences loved it at test screenings. They didn't care that Peckinpah had made something completely unique. His only western without extreme violence. A western comedy about a penniless vagabond who accidentally stumbles onto a water spring in a desert wasteland and creates a profitable way station for stagecoach traffic. But the studio just wanted to be done with it. As Stella Stevens put it, Warner Brothers didn't release it. They flushed it. When you've got Charles Bronson, Lee Marvin, Angie Dickinson, and Carl Weathers all in the same movie, how the hell does Hollywood just forget about it? This one's loosely based on the real-life manhunt of Albert Johnson, the so-called Mad Trapper of Rat River. If you know the actual history, this movie doesn't really follow it. But, as producer Murray Shostak put it, the story isn't twisted. We're not making a documentary. The real Albert Johnson was a mysterious trapper in the Yukon, and in 1931, he led the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on a brutal manhunt across the Arctic. We're talking weeks of surviving sub-zero temperatures, crossing mountains people thought were impossible to cross, and somehow outmaneuvering his pursuers over and over again. Eventually, the Mounties caught up with him on the frozen Eagle River, where he was finally shot and killed. Death Hunt takes that story and kind of does its own thing. Instead of keeping Johnson as an enigma, they go for a more sympathetic take. Charles Bronson himself even admitted, "The more I read about Albert Johnson, the more I felt he should be made sympathetic." And then there's Lee Marvin, who didn't care about accuracy in the slightest. He said, "It's not a documentary. Documentaries show at little theaters and at schools." I loved the movie. I've never seen so many rotten people in one film. And yet, despite all this, the movie bombed. The box office was described as lethargic, which is a nice way of saying nobody showed up. And that's just ridiculous because Bronson and Marvin together should have been printing money. But for whatever reason, bad marketing, bad timing, Death Hunt got buried. This is a Western Hollywood actively tried to bury. After Easy Rider blew up, Universal came up with this genius idea: give young directors small budgets and complete creative control. No studio interference, just pure cinema. And then, when they got the movies back, they panicked, because it wasn't what they wanted at all. One of those movies was The Hired Hand, Peter Fonda's directorial debut. He didn't want to make another biker movie. He wanted to make something his father, Henry Fonda, might have done. So he took this quiet, poetic script about a cowboy who returns home after years of drifting and turned it into a slow, atmospheric character study. Universal hated it. They saw it, decided it was an art movie, and basically refused to release it properly. The movie opened in 52 theaters and was gone in 2 weeks. Fonda later said, "Universal tried to bury this film back in '71, but the people who loved it really loved it." And those people included some pretty big names. Scorsese personally picked it for a Tribeca revival. Clint Eastwood has credited it as an influence on Unforgiven. Even Tarantino owns a copy of the original theatrical trailer. It was a flop in 1971. Today it's a cult classic. Gregory Peck, one of the greatest actors of his era, and yet one of his best movies is completely ignored. The Gunfighter is about an aging gunslinger, Jimmy Ringo, who's just tired. He's trying to go straight, but his reputation keeps following him. Everywhere he goes, some young hotshot wants to challenge him, including one kid who he has to kill in self-defense, leading to a whole lot of people hunting him down. And what really makes this movie work is Peck himself. He plays Ringo as this worn-out, exhausted man who just wants out. No theatrics, no big heroic moments, just a guy who knows his time is running out. But you know what the studio hated? His mustache. Seriously, the head of 20th Century Fox was furious when he saw Peck with facial hair. But by the time he got back from a trip and tried to make him shave it, half the movie was already shot. After the film underperformed at the box office, Skouras apparently ran into Peck and told him, "That mustache cost us millions." Peck, for the record, loved this movie. He called it one of my favorite pictures of all the pictures I've made. Critics have since come around to it, but at the time Fox had no idea how to sell it, and the movie just faded into the background. Jeff Bridges, Sam Waterston, Harry Dean Stanton, and Slim Pickens in a goofy Western comedy. Sounds great, right? Well, Roger Ebert hated it. This one's about two lazy cattle rustlers messing with a rich rancher who won't shut up about his prize bull. He's got a helicopter, they've got old pickup trucks, and the whole movie plays like it wants to be a Robert Altman film. Problem is, it's so laid back, it kind of forgets to be a movie. Now, if you like weird, whimsical 70s flicks, this one's got some charm. The Montana landscapes look great, and honestly, it's way more underrated than it deserves to be. But Ebert wasn't having it. He called it disastrously wrong. Rancho Deluxe is way off form for Frank Perry. I don't know how this movie went so disastrously wrong, but it did. And the story must be a sad one. It's not the worst Western ever made. But if you want to see Jeff Bridges in one of his weirdest, most forgotten roles, this is it. Everyone knows Charlton Heston from The Ten Commandments. Everyone knows him from Planet of the Apes. But this is a deep-cut Heston movie that only hardcore fans even remember. Heston plays an aging lawman in 1909 Arizona who's forced out of retirement when his old enemy, played by James Coburn, busts out of prison and comes gunning for him. And when I say this is a brutal movie, I mean brutal. It's violent, mean, and totally uninterested in making either of these guys look heroic. They're just two bitter old bastards in a West that doesn't have a place for them anymore. James Coburn later admitted he had a hard time justifying his character's vendetta, said the guy had no redeeming qualities. He was just out for revenge. And as for director Andrew V. McLaglen, Coburn put it bluntly, he knows how to go out, shoot a film, and get it done. That's about all. Source novelist Brian Garfield liked this screen adaptation of his Gun Down novel and gave the film a thumbs up. But the movie flopped, and nobody really talks about it anymore. Okay, where else are you going to see Jack Nicholson and Marlon Brando in a Western together? The Missouri Breaks should have been a massive hit. Brando had just come off The Godfather. Nicholson had just won an Oscar for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was directed by Arthur Penn, who made Bonnie and Clyde. Instead, it flopped at the box office. The plot's about a rancher hiring a bounty hunter to take down a gang of horse thieves, but nobody was watching this for the story. They were watching to see two of the biggest actors of all time go head-to-head. The problem was, they hated each other. Nicholson was losing his mind because Brando refused to memorize his lines, instead reading them off cue cards, and Brando was just straight up messing with everyone. His performance was mostly improvised. At one point, the director just gave up and let him do whatever he wanted. Nicholson was so frustrated, but years later, he still admitted that Brando was one of the most mesmerizing actors he'd ever worked with. There's nothing ill-advised for Marlon Brando. He is a horse of a different color. He can do what he wants. The film ended up grossing $14 million against a $10 million budget, so technically not a total disaster. But for a movie with this cast and this hype, it was a huge disappointment. The writer hated how much of his script got tossed out, and even Brando later admitted the movie just wasn't very good. This one had everything going for it. Big stars: James Caan, Jane Fonda, Jason Robards. A unique setting, the Old West, but in the 1940s. And somehow, it still ended up as a total financial disappointment. The story follows two struggling ranchers, Caan and Fonda, trying to hold onto their land while fighting off a power-hungry land baron played by Robards. It's not your typical Western, but it is a slow, brooding drama with long, contemplative shots of horses and landscapes. So, classic 70s revisionist Western energy. Richard Farnsworth, a longtime stuntman who had never played a major speaking role before, ended up stealing the entire movie. And at 58 years old, he landed his first big acting role and got nominated for an Oscar. Meanwhile, the actual leads, Caan and Fonda, walked away with nothing. But what really makes this one a disaster isn't just the box office failure, it's the fact that a stuntman actually died on set. Jim Shepard was filming a scene where he was supposed to be dragged by a horse, but the horse veered off course, slamming him into a fence post. He was killed instantly. And the worst part is, the scene still made it into the final cut, right up until the fatal moment. Despite all that, the movie barely made $9.6 million against its $10 to $12 million budget, which means Hollywood's big idea of a modern Western ended up being just another expensive flop.